Hello and welcome to Murder Analysed. I'm Christina Moore. Now today's case is the Sally Anne Bowman case. She was murdered on the 25th of September 2005 in London, Croydon, London, and she was murdered by a man called Mark Dixie. But before we go on to the case of her murder, I want to talk a little bit about Sally Anne Bowman. She may only have been 18 at the time of her murder, but this girl, in her short life, had already made an impact. She had such great self-worth. She had studied hard, one, to be a hairdresser, and she was a part-time hairdresser at the time of her murder, but she had also been to drama school. She was also modelling. She was singing and wanted her ambition at even such a young age. She wanted to be on the cover of Vogue magazine, and she worked and worked and worked for that. But also, she was compared to Kate Moss. So this girl had a future that this girl had made herself. Unfortunately, one night in Croydon, London, just metres from her home, she bumped into Mark Dixie, who is a terrible, terrible abuser of women, a rapist and a murderer, and not only in the UK, but in many other countries. So this case is the case of Sally Anne Bowman, 18 at the time of her death. It also talks in depth about Mark Dixie and his previous crimes before he was convicted of this murder. We also then look at the DNA and the database and how it was set up, because it was from this murder that really there was a lot of pressure on the government to set up a DNA database because of the time it took to catch Mark Dixie, and that then left him room to do other crimes. And if he hadn't have been caught, and it was really only caught, he was only really caught by DNA, and it wasn't through any murder or rape that he'd done what the DNA came from. But we'll go into that more. But this man would have gone on and gone on and gone on to really abuse and hurt women and murder women in such a terrible way. So Sally Anne, she was born on the 11th September 1987. And she was born in London. She was the youngest of 4 daughters, and her mum and dad were Paul and Linda Bowman, who after this, I think, crime, later divorced. Sally Anne attended the BRIT School for Performing Arts and Technology in Croydon, and as I say, this was all part of her dream to become a model, which she had now secured some modelling jobs, some quite, good modelling jobs. She joined Pulse Modelling Management Company, and it was a local modelling agency. And I think she became the face of Swatch watches. So, she was getting paid for her modelling, and she was really quite good at it. And as I said before, she was sort of going to be the next Kate Moss. And I think she knew it, and she was proud of that. She'd worked for that. Nothing's given when you're a model. They work absolutely really hard to get where they are. And so for this young girl, I think it's such a shame with this murder of this girl that it really cut not only her hopes and dreams down, but her parents. Because, as I said, she was murdered so close to the home, literally metres from her door. So this case is going to be probably a disturbing case for some people. So I'm going to talk about murders, I'm going to talk about rapes, and many rapes of women that this man has done, sexual assaults and things on women. So if this case is not for you, you should switch off now. So let's talk a little bit about the night, I think, that she was murdered. At around 10 p.m. on the 24th of September 2005, Sally Ann and her older sister, Nicole, and a group of friends went out to Lloyd's bar in Croydon, where they stayed till about 1 a.m. time. After leaving the bar, Sally Ann waited outside for a little while, for about 15 minutes, and then she took a taxi to a friend's house. I think they wanted to carry on a bit of a party, and they was going back to a friend's house. So she was with this group of people. She had gone to the friend's house, and I think that's where she intended then to stay. Now, she did have a boyfriend, Lewis, but and he had agreed to pick her up from this friend's house. But I think Nicole, her sister, had been arrested for fighting. So plans changed. So she said to her boyfriend, Lewis, I'll get a taxi back into Croydon town and just pick me up from there. So when he picked her up, it was about 2:20 a.m. in the morning. So, you know, not, I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to London, but London, whether it's 2 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it's still really busy. So anyway, he picks her up, but while in the car, she's been drinking, he's picked her up, she's young, he's young, they started having a fight. A row over sort of infidelities and things that 18-year-olds row over. And so he usually drops her right to the front door of her home. But this time they parked down the road so they could continue this row in the car, Lewis and her. So they're continuing this row to about 4 a.m. actually in the morning. So it's been a good couple of hours in this car having this row. So rather than turning around and driving her to her door, because it was only a few houses up where they'd parked, she gets out of the car in a bit of a rage, slams the door and leaves him in the car, and he drives home. Sally walks up to just near her front door where she's attacked. So I think what happened first was she was stabbed in the neck, and that stopped her from screaming out. And it was a vicious attack, this, really a vicious attack. Then he stabbed her in the stomach. Now, when he stabbed her in the stomach, the knife went right through to the spine, immobilising her. So now she can't speak. She can't call for help. Could literally see her front door. She can't move because where he stabbed her so viciously through the stomach. It's dislodged the spine, it's gone into the spine, it's damaged the spine. Then what he does is he then rapes her. Now, by her wounds, she was dying, and it wouldn't have took her very long to die if she wasn't already dead by the time he was raping her. But this Mark Dixie doesn't really care whether you're dead or alive, because all he wanted was to have sex with this girl. And this girl could have been anyone walking at this street at this time of night. It could have been anybody. It just happened to be her. So after he'd raped her, left her there, either dying or dead, unable to speak, unable to walk or crawl or do anything to get herself any help, he then robs her. He takes her handbag, he takes her cardigan, he takes her underwear, leaving her then exposed in front of her family home, to where the father then finds her in the early hours of the morning. In such a disgraceful way, really. He just discarded her. And I think the reason he took the underwear was because evidence. A lot of the time they take the underwear, but also because some, well, quite a lot actually, of these perpetrators like to keep bits of you or the victims as trophies so they can relive it. So he's took the handbag because he wants the money and he wants to rob her. He's took her phone, he's took her underwear, and he's took her cardigan. So, you know, so what happened then when she was found the next day, because she was so close to the home, you couldn't have missed her. her boyfriend, because he was the last one, Lewis, to see her alive. So he dropped her off, didn't he? Well, of course he told the truth. They had a row. So when you're talking about police, and you're talking about an investigation into a murder like this one, vicious rape and murder of an 18-year-old girl so close to her home, you would automatically think it would be someone that she knew. And he would be, for me even, the prime suspect, because one, he's there. Two, he feels there's infidelity that's gone on, so that could create the rape, when you're looking at it from a psychological point of view. He was the last one to see her alive. He dropped her off, and he was held in custody actually for 4 days, and it was the DNA testing then on certain, evidence that eliminated him from that inquiry. So thank God, really, in 2005 we had DNA that could actually eliminate you from an investigation, or this man would have gone to prison for a very, very long time for a murder he didn't commit. In 2005, and it wasn't until the 28th of June 2006 that a 35-year-old Croydon man named Mark Dixie was arrested under suspicion of murdering Anne Bowman. He was charged with Bowman's murder and remanded in custody, awaiting trial, and the only reason they could do this was because 2 or 3 weeks prior to his arrest, he was a chef in a pub in London, and he got into a fight. And as we go through the DNA and the goods and the pros and cons of DNA, and how we take DNA now in certain crimes, at that point, Mark Dixie's DNA was taken because he was in this fight. And so in 2006, the police then, if you was arrested or charged even, or even questioned, or actually even a witness to a crime, you could have your DNA taken. His DNA was never taken for any sexual assault on women at all, in any country that he had been in, or had been a suspect in, or in some cases been deported from countries for sexual abuse or sexual acts against women. The DNA wasn't taken, or if it was taken, it wasn't shared like it is today. So Mark Dixie had this fight in his restaurant, or in his kitchen, where he was a chef, with this group of men, and that subsequently then ended up with him being taken in for questioning, having his DNA and his fingerprints taken, and that's how they caught Mark Dixie for Anne Bowman's murder. Without that fight, he wouldn't have been caught for many, many years. So it still took them, though, about 9 months, really, or just over 9 months, to get this man. So of course, when he's arrested, as they always do, he said, "She was dead when I found her. I just thought I'd sleep with her." So, you can't get done for raping a dead body. So he was admitting to the rape, because that's why his DNA was there, but he said she was already laying there dead. I mean, they try it, really. I've heard so many stories in interviews, you wouldn't believe it, but this one, I think he was just trying everything. But then when he was arrested for that murder, a lot then started coming out about Mark Dixie. And he went to court for this murder, and I think in February 2008 he was charged with the murder of Anne Bowman. He admitted having sex with her, as I said, but not with the murder. But a jury didn't take very long actually to convict him. I think 3 hours of deliberations, that was about it, 2 or 3 hours, and they found him guilty of that. Now, in all criminal cases, previous stuff really don't come into it, because you really can only, you want the jury to know about the crime and they can be charged with the crime they've done now, not previous, because they should have already been dealt with that. So previous only usually comes out later on, after the person's been either sentenced or let off, because you only want to give, you want to have a fair trial, because if you try to bring something into a trial that's going to give the defence something later on to appeal on, that's how a lot of these cases are lost. So this trial was a very good trial, actually. It was just about this murder. They knew their DNA was there, and they left it then down to the jury to whether to believe him or not, that he'd just come across this dead or dying girl and had sex with her, or was he the one that actually attacked her, beat her, stabbed her, raped her and robbed her and murdered her. And they said he was. And I think the evidence really, proves that without a shadow of a doubt. So now let's have a look at Mark Dixie himself. A little bit of background, but then his other crimes. So Mark Dixie was born in Streatham, South London. His parents separated when he was about 18 months old. Then I think when he was about 8, his mother remarried, and she had 2 sons by the other husband. There doesn't seem to be too much in his background, apart from, I suppose, this disruption, this loss, or you could say that he may felt that he had been rejected as a child, and then the mother then moved on to another man, even though she was good to him. But in a child's eyes, sometimes when that happens, where the father goes out the picture at such a young age, and the new father comes in, and then you have 2 other children, and I think with Mark Dixie, he felt something about that relationship, or that he didn't really fit into that. But he was quite a strange child anyway. He again, a loner. He said he was a bit of a loner, but he did have quite a bit of a temper, even from a very young age. So I think with him, he smoked a lot of drugs. He was a bit of a drinker, I wouldn't say he's an alcoholic, but he was a drinker. But he did use substance abuse. He had marijuana and also cocaine. Now, cocaine, when you have a lot of it, and he took a lot of it, can make you become quite violent and aggressive, and feel like you're more powerful and stronger than you are. Not that it's any excuse for murder, because there is no excuse. And actually, if you try and use being drunk or being on drugs as an excuse for any crime, that won't work. But I think for him, he tried to justify why he had done what he did to Sally Ann, saying, oh, it's because I was on drugs, and I didn't know what I was doing. But I think it isn't until later on, when all his past crimes came out, and it just showed what a shocking man, what a real criminal this man was. So in 1986, he had his first conviction. Now, it's not saying he's not done anything before, because he probably has, but this time in 1986 in Stockwell, he mugged a woman at knife point. He was caught for that, and he served 6 weeks in detention for that. Then, I think in 1987, he moved to Sidcup and he was convicted of burglary and robbery. And in 1988, he was convicted of indecent assault. So in 1987, 1988 is when we know where his sexual assaults started. Then he indecently exposed himself. It's another one of these that like to expose himself, and again now escalated on from that. And he was sentenced to 2 years probation. So you can indecently assault someone, you can expose yourself, you can do burglary and robbery, and you're going to get probation. So That wasn't a deterrent for him, was it? So later in 1988 of the same year, he was then convicted of indecent assault and assault by actual bodily harm, so ABH. And in 1989, he was convicted of indecent exposure and was sentenced to 80 hours of community service. It doesn't stop there, it gets worse. In 1990, he was convicted of assaulting a police officer. Dixie lived in Australia from 1993, and he overstayed his visa. And Australia won't have that. If you overstay your visa and you get caught, you're thrown out. You're just thrown out. And he was deported in 1999. So he really overstayed his year visa if he went in 1993 and he stayed till 1999. But he was actually deported in 1999 after he had convicted a sexual offence for which he was fined. I mean, I know Australia likes to give out fines, but I thought Australian system was a little bit harsher than that. But probably his first offence, and probably what they wanted to do, knowing Australians, is thinking he's illegally here. We'll fine him, we can deport him, and let England deal with him. Well, of course, once you find someone and you've deported them from that country, unless though you're saying when he arrives back here that he needs to be on charges for something else which they didn't have. So once the fine was paid, that case was then over. So Dixie was accused of sexual assault in 2001, where it is believed that he masturbated in front of a woman in a telephone booth. He was not prosecuted for that one either. So he'd been sent back from Australia in 1999, where he had sexually assaulted a woman there, for which he was fined. And then he comes back to this country in 2001, masturbates in front of a woman in a telephone booth, and he wasn't prosecuted for it. So we've got really from 1986 to 2001 that this man was escalating. Now, you can tell that by these are the crimes we know. So in 2006, Mark Dixie's DNA was sent to Western Australia to be tested against the DNA evidence of a Claremont serial killer case. Now these were between 1996 and 1997. Now we know he was in Australia from 1993 to 1999. It was believed that he was in the area at that time of these killings, and he may have committed them. So at his trial of Anne Bowman, a Thai woman from Australia came and gave evidence at that trial, because she says that Mark Dixie in 1998 in Australia knifed her and raped her, and she wanted him to be charged with that attempted murder and rape of her. So DNA then was taken from her underwear that she was wearing, that the Australian police had, and it had been matched to Mark Dixie. The next thing with Mark Dixie, he continually claimed that he was always on this, drink and drugs, and had gone out to buy more cocaine, and so he can't remember and stuff. This was always his excuse. He would never really, and he never did, admit anything. Everything about Mark Dixie, every crime this man has done, has had to be worked at to get this man. So in 2007, again, a DNA match of a raped woman in Figueroa in Spain. And in August 2003, a Romanian man had been already sentenced to 15 years and put in prison for this rape and sexual assault of 2 women that they were committed nearby where they now know that Dixie was. And also, in the same way, this knife, this rape of these women. Now, this man was later, he was still in prison in 2015. This man, Dustin, I think his name was still in prison on this charge of rape and murder, rape and a knife attack and rape of 2 women in Fuengirola in Spain. And he was innocent. So in 2015, into 2000, or June 2015, you had this Dutch newspaper, and they reported that Dixie confessed and to these rapes. So, and to these 2 sexual assaults on these women that this other man, Dustin, had served 12 years for, and he was an innocent man. I don't know why they didn't get DNA before to try and sort it out. But he was finally exonerated and freed in February 2016 after spending 12 years in prison, this man. So Dixie was again then found guilty of Bowman's murder on the 22nd of February 2008. He was sentenced to life in prison at the Old Bailey, and the judge recommended that he should not be released. But we have a lot of judges, well mainly all the judges in these cases, recommend that these people should not be released, and he gave him a minimum sentence, I think, of 34 years. That would would make Dixie, when he would be released, about 70-year-old. Well, I don't think 70-year-old is enough to stop you committing these sort of crimes. Just because you're 70 doesn't mean to say you can't commit a crime. And then let's hope this man doesn't last that long. But he is, it means he's likely to remain in prison until 2040. Then he will start then going for parole. But the way that our parole board is at the moment, he'll probably get out, and but hopefully he won't get out before 2040. So Dixie, Mark Dixie, was convicted of the 2 rapes in Fuengirola in Spain, and that happened in 1986 and again in 1982. There was 2 other rapes, and he had then received 2 life sentences for them on top of the other, so he's probably not going to get out. So let's now look at the DNA. Let's look at this DNA, because in the last case we done, Pitchfork case, we talked about the development of DNA when it comes to solving crimes, and that was the first case then that DNA was used, one then to eliminate someone from being a suspect, and also used and how they separated them, both the DNA strands, so that then they can really tell exactly who done that murder. And Colin Pitchfork was their first case in that. So now we have Sally Ann Bowman. The only reason that this man was caught, this Mark Dixie, was because of DNA. So yes, we'd already started in 2005 having this database sort of starting, and then it got to a point where the police wanted, or the family and some police officers, but not so much the government, wanted a database where everyone's DNA, guilty or innocent, would have been on a DNA register. That was turned down, and there's many reasons why that shouldn't be done. But over the years, what we have done is built up a database of DNA. So for people that have done serious crimes or have done a crime, and there are people on there that have been a witness to a serious crime or even just a witness to a crime, the laws now is that unless you have been convicted of a crime, or been charged with a serious crime, your DNA may be taken, but it wouldn't have stayed on there for very long. But when you think of Mark Dixie, he wasn't first arrested for a serious crime in this country. His DNA was taken for a fight in a pub. It wasn't a serious sexual assault or anything else that got Mark Dixie's DNA. It was just a simple fight in a pub, and everyone had their DNA taken. And I think that is still agreeable today, and I think that's what should happen, because when your DNA now is put into this database, you will be flagged up if there's any crime with your DNA on it. It flags it up straight away. And so they now know that they don't need to keep DNA forever. And it's illegal really to do that, and unethical in a lot of ways. And even Alec Jeffries, who developed the DNA fingerprinting stuff, for the first case, never wanted it to be used as a tool to keep everybody's DNA. It was to be used as a tool to find criminals. But I always say, and I think it's really good to remember this point, is you're only ever a criminal once you're caught. And you're only going to have your DNA taken once you're caught. So DNA can't solve everything. It can definitely solve cold cases if that DNA, or now the familiar DNA from a family member, is in the database. So in England and Wales, it's only really the initial samples that are taken, and if you're a convicted criminal or you're a person waiting trial, then your DNA would be taken and then be placed on there. The Criminal Justice and Police Act, I think 2001, changed this to allow the DNA to be retained from people charged with an offence, even if they were subsequently acquitted. Because we've seen it before, and I think there's cases that I've done before, that people have been acquitted. And I think the reason for that case is when we look at the Babes in the Woods case. He was first acquitted for the murders of them two girls. Then he went on to rape and try and murder the 7-year-old. So just because someone's acquitted doesn't always mean to say they're innocent. Doesn't mean to say they're guilty either in a lot of cases. So I think it's right that that should be kept on there. So the Criminal Justice Act 2003 later allowed DNA to be taken on arrest rather than on a charge. So, and I think in 2004 the law came into force, and in 2012 anybody arrested in England and Wales on suspicion of involvement in a recordable crime offence, the exceptions of minor offences, had their DNA samples taken, and then they're stored in the database, whether or not they are subsequently charged or convicted. So in 2005-2006, this is UK figures, 45,000 crimes were matched against records on the DNA database, including 422 homicides, murders and manslaughters, and 645 rapes. It's a definite benefit, DNA. So I think when we have some criticism really of this database, and as I said, Alec Jeffries, who actually designed this technique and who is a forensic scientist, argues that this DNA should be used not against innocent. Innocent people shouldn't have their DNA on there. It's not necessary to have it on there. So when we look now at when you're being, you see a car accident or you see a serious crime, you can refuse to have your DNA taken. You don't need it, but even if they take it, they wouldn't keep it very long anyway. It's just, I think, to go through the machine and come out, but you haven't got to give it. If you are, though, arrested, or you're, charged with something, or you're a witness, or you're there at a serious crime, yes, they still can. And the thing is with DNA, and I think this is what makes critics so bad about it, is because the police and the government don't really hold the DNA. The database is run by a separate third party. And the thing is with DNA, is it's us, our DNA. And if you have third parties or fourth parties or fifth, they sell on your data, it could lead then, and this is well known what it could lead, and this is a lot of the arguments and what the critics use to say why not everyone, we should have a database where everyone's DNA is on the database. Because if you have an illness and you have an insurance company that want to check the DNA before they give you life insurance or before they give you health insurance, they could exempt you from that because of that. So it can be as simple or as in-depth as that, really. So DNA, because it contains everything about us, it should only be kept for a short time if it's someone that's not charged with a serious crime or arrested on a serious crime. I think that's why the law, and I think this is why the government wouldn't respond, didn't want the headache that it would be to hold that much data on everybody in this country and allow a third party to manage that. And for someone to get hold of that, I mean, when we talk about lost data, or you talk about your data, your medical records have gone missing, or someone's left something on a train that has got your details on it. Data protection. Data is also your DNA. Your DNA tells more about you than anything else in this world. So it has to be protected. So I can see both arguments. But when it comes to criminal law, when it comes to getting people like Mark Dixie off the street, and it was a simple fight that he gave his DNA, the police took his DNA for, without that DNA sample being taken, this man would be free, and we would have been seeing a lot more murders that he has committed without this DNA, and without this database, and without these police using DNA techniques. Now DNA is even better now than it was then, because now we can tell if a family member who's gone to prison for stealing a sweet out of a shop or a loaf of bread or robbery, that then comes up as a familiar DNA. So they now know that someone in your family linked to you has done that crime. So someone may have done a robbery here, and his sixth cousin or third cousin down the line, or uncle, brother, is over here committing murder. From that one piece of DNA, now they can now track back to find out, and there is a case for that worked when they went back on the familiar DNA, and it came to 3 brothers, and I think I'll do that. I can't remember what the case is called at the moment. One brother had died, 2 were still alive, and the one they thought that did it said that the brother that had died had done it, but the brother that died didn't have blue eyes. Now DNA now, how we can tell now who's done what is even down to your eye colour. So this is how advanced we are becoming now with DNA. But as we become advanced with DNA, the criminals, because if you can't find a body, you can't get DNA. So as we advance, so do they. They know. Criminals are not stupid. Now, Mark Dixie, he is probably a serial killer in Australia. He's definitely a rapist in Australia. He's a rapist and a murderer here. He's a rapist and attempted murderer in Spain. In a very short time, from 1986 to his first offence to 2005, when they found out that was what they know as his last victim, was Anne Bowman. He done a lot of crimes all over the world, and it was one piece of DNA taken by a couple of police officers who were investigating a fight in a pub that got this man caught. It took them a long time to get him because, you know, they had to wait for the DNA and stuff like that, but they got him in the end. The jury saw straight through him. Now I think I want to come back to Anne Bowman, because she was buried, her parents buried her. I mean, you'd have thought they'd have gone through enough, wouldn't you? Shocking murder. The youngest daughter was murdered. The youngest daughter, the ambition and the talent that this girl had been taken away. They buried this child. Devastated. Ended their marriage. It was that devastating. Within 4 years, they had to remove her body, her ashes, from where she was buried because of vandals. As if these people hadn't been through enough. So now we've got vandals vandalising her grave, vandalising, writing graffiti, writing terrible things about this girl. So this girl's body now has been removed, her ashes have been removed to a place of sanctuary where no one knows, because it's a day and the age we live in that we have got people that will go and desecrate a grave for sheer fun or jealousy maybe. So we have a killer behind bars. We have a family now who's been tormented, I think, for years by this murder. And we have Anne Bowman that died at 18. It's a shocking case, this one. Absolutely shocking. Anyway, this has been the Anne Bowman murder. 2005, 18-year-old model, singer, dancer, hairdresser, talented girl, murdered. Let me know what you think about this case. It'd be interesting to see your comments on this one. So, you know what to do. Thumbs up if you've liked it, you know, hit that thumbs up button. You can click on Lacey's logo up there that she puts up on our logo and subscribe to us. You can also follow us on Instagram and on Facebook. So, thanks for watching. Until the next time. Bye bye.